Good morning, good day, and good evening, dear participants of the course on National Multidimensional Poverty Index. My name is Elena Danilova Cross, and I work for UNDP Istanbul Regional Hub. Today, I will be giving you an overview of the countries in the region of Europe and Central Asia and what had happened over time since the advent of the multidimensional poverty index in this region. I will speak about bottlenecks, about challenges, opportunities, and ways forward. And I will also present to you some concrete examples from the countries which are either adopted the national MPI or are in the process of doing so. So let me start by saying that after the advent of global MPI, it was not really well received by the decision makers and even statisticians in this region, only for the reason that the significance of the depth and deprivations and headcounts and intensity of global MPI results for the countries in the region were really, really low. For example, if I take all the countries in this region, probably Tajikistan would show the worst cases from the demographic and household survey from 2017, where the MPI value was only 0.3, and the proportion of the population would be 7.4% of the entire population, which are multidimensionally poor. So some countries like Belarus, Serbia, Armenia were showing, or Ukraine were showing really nearly zero results. So the value was really, really low. That's why we couldn't really create the interest in developing more or looking into the three dimensions of this MPI to understand what it may mean for the country. But when you go into the global MPI, into this disaggregated data by health, by education, and by living standards, what was uniting most of the countries is that in most of them, the highest deprivation was in the area of health, especially significantly in countries like Belarus, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, and Armenia, with few exceptions, for example, like Russian Federation, where the mostly deprived people were in the area of education. So overall, the average health count as of today from the MPI 2019 for this region was something like 1.1%, and the value is 0.004, which is extremely low, and it is more than 10 times lower than the global averages. Why? Because, as I said, this is the group of countries which are highly developed or developing, and this reflects only the internal diversity of the region between the countries or within the countries. And the intensity, which is less than 38%, is also minimal distance from the global averages. So there are, of course, the people who are poor, and they're really poor. We can even name some groups of the population like Roma, which is very well known and accepted in this region. And it also reflects inequality within the countries. If you try to run correlations between the Human Development Index and the global multidimensional poverty index, you will see the high correlation between the higher the Human Development Index, the lower is the multidimensional poverty index. So, but of course, if you try to subdivide them by subgroups like Balkans without Turkey, or new EU member states, or Western CIS, they are grouped more intensively in the center. For example, if we speak about the Balkans, their Human Development Index is quite medium average, but the MPI is very low. But when we take the subregion of Caucasus and Central Asia, the Human Development Index is as at the same level as for the Balkan states, but the intensity and the value of the MPI is quite high. So let us go by country case studies. I will start with Armenia, because Armenia, as of today, is the only country in this region which officially is a member of the multidimensional poverty peer network, which unites all the countries which who adopted this measure for the national calculations to inform the decision making. And it was developed with the help of the World Bank back in 2015 for three reasons. First of all, they wanted to describe the complexity of the poverty. So they went away from the consumption or income, monetary poverty. They wanted to understand how deep it is and how meaningful and where it is present in the context of the country. To understand the depths and persistence of this poverty, and also they wanted to benefit by complementing their national measures of poverty by consumption with the multidimensional poverty. And last but not the least, they were planning to inform the policy making to monitor the progress on development goals. Specifically, they developed the Armenian development strategy for 2014 and 25. And they hoped that this MPI would really help them to reduce the poverty between the midterm period and totally eliminate the extreme poverty. And it would help them to progress with the human development measurements and indicators overall, and also help accelerate the territorial development to decrease the regional disparities. While introducing and adopting the national MPI, the country, together with the help of the World Bank, had multiple rounds of consultations. They started with the National Statistical Service, which is the statistical agency in the country. They run consultations and roundtables with international organizations. Together with UNEC, they had a few conferences in Geneva and Sochi. Of course, they consulted all the line ministries in Armenia and had consultations with the civil society. So they ended up with the national index, multidimensional poverty index, which had 5 pillars. So apart from standards, living standards or basic needs, let's say education and health, they also introduced the pillar on housing, which was separate to basic needs because they were concentrating on things like healthy heating or overcrowding or hot running water, centralized water system, access to transportation, quality of public services in the housing pillar. And for the labor pillar, actually indicators were chosen in the areas of labor market participation, long-term unemployment, decent jobs, and underemployment. So this measure is calculated by the statistical agency every year and is available on their websites. Now let's move to Turkey. Turkey is the country which was considering to introduce national MPI for a quite long time. Their statistical agency, which is called Turkstat, was thinking to use SILK, which is the survey as a source of survey, which is widely used in the, for example, European countries, as a source of multidimensional indicators. And apart from the monetary aspects, they tried to introduce such pillars as education, health, dwelling, and labor force. So you see the labor force or labor dimension or employment is here, and they were trying to design the indicators around the areas of long-term unemployment and non-registered employment. The dwelling pillar was supposed to include indicators of availability of inside bath or toilet or central hot water or heating dwelling and number of persons per rooms, which is also an overcrowding measure. So this is still an ongoing methodological studies. And they plan to do some empirical studies based on the results of the recent silk. They want to to do the experimental studies based on different scenarios, and the results is yet to be published. But I recently came across one publication which I found on the website. It's a working paper as of December 2019 on the topography and sources of the multidimensional poverty in Turkey. And I was very pleased to see a very interesting new domain which was introduced, which is environment. It's environment in its broad understanding, because it includes housing infrastructure problems, which is extremely relevant for the country like Turkey, including its proneness to earthquakes. It's about noise pollution, especially in the urban areas with huge traffic and overcrowding of the transport. But it also included such indicators as environmental pollution and neighborhood crime. So I believe this study is still not official. I mean, it's not accepted by the government, but there are, as they promised, they are doing some empirical studies and consider different results by different think tanks and institutions. Now we move to Belarus. Belarus was probably the country with the least presence of multidimensional people in poverty based on the global MPI. It was nearly zero, according to the global indicators in the MPI. But what triggered them to really look into it were a few things. First, Belarus is still very active on the regional platforms, statistical platforms for measuring poverty. One of them is UNECE statistical platforms for poverty, where in the last few years we were discussing a lot multidimensional poverty, and Ofi and Sabina herself were presenting and even included a chapter on measuring MPI in the latest guidelines for measuring poverty in the region. But I think what also helped Belarus to really look into this area was the introduction of the Sustainable Development Goals, and the alternative or proxy measure for the target 1.2 on national poverty was really like well taken by the Belstat and also the politicians, decision makers in the country, as a very good proxy, which is in a form of index which covers many areas, and also since many countries are using it even to measure leaving no one behind, or one element of leaving no one behind. So this country is also experimenting, and it's in the process of designing. I will just tell you where they are. They have an option of 5 pillars with an equal weight between them. One pillar is health, another is education, the third is employment, the fourth is income and welfare, and the last one is living conditions. But when you go into the choice of the indicators, which are 8 of them, the weight is between them is different. Maybe I will now concentrate on the pillar on income and welfare, which is not really like standard for the global MPI, which says we put aside the income component and we concentrate on non-monetary, but Belarus is still thinking of measuring poverty through the poverty rate in the MPI, in the national MPI. And for the well-being, they look into the inability to pay unforeseen expenses and the lack of savings, if necessary. They consider the deprivations in the depth on payment on housing and utilities due to the inability to pay, lack of inability to connect to the internet at home because they cannot pay, and also the households which do not have a private vehicle or car or have only one of the following, either the personal vehicle or washing machine or dishwasher or vacuum cleaner. So what's next with this experiment for them? They want to discuss it within different working groups and line ministries. maybe adjust indicators if necessary, and calculate several options with different scenarios for national indices to determine the most suitable one, and then to consider this index for social policy development, and introduce it into the calculations in the statistical practices, including into the SDGs. And Bellstat already put national MPI as a proxy for measuring target 1.2 for SDG 1 on poverty, on national poverty. Now we will speak about Moldova. Moldova had initiated the nationalization of MPI very recently, only last October, November. They partnered with OFI and UNDP on that, and we helped them to design 6 dimensions for their national MPI because they were running the pilot household budget surveys and they wanted to test it in a sample. So what is interesting about the national pillars of this MPI is that they, for example, include such a pillar as human dignity and corruption. So they talk about, they choose the indicator on the corruption in social sphere and in life, in dignity. They also have such a component as social protection, for example, the dependence on public social aid or non-public forms of social help. And I forgot to mention that in the human dignity, they are also considering the indicator on dependence on remittances, which is also an interesting factor. They also have a pillar on housing, infrastructure, and environment, and one of the ideas is also to include the natural disaster indicator. But let's see how they will progress with that, and the results are expected, the initial results from the pilot surveys will be released later this March, and throughout the April this year they plan to institutionalize and adopt the national MPI and also make it user-friendly for the interpretation and disseminate and communicate to the general public. Now, Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan is partnering with UNICEF for adopting the MPI for their national needs, but Kyrgyzstan is known for using the sort of a quasi-national MPI, which was published in several of its national human development reports in the past, but now they took a more thorough analysis onto what this national MPI may include, and they have 6 pillars. One of them is monetary poverty, another is education, then living conditions. Interesting pillar on food security, which uses such indicators as calorie intake or household dietary or diversity of dietary. It has a component or pillar on economic security and health. So we know that they are also nearing the results, receiving the results of their calculations, because my latest information was that they were still considering potential indicators, and they are still playing up with which indicators to keep and which indicators to put away. So we hope that this national MPI, the results will be interpreted in a separate paper and may be included into the voluntary national review, which the country will be presenting this July, the high-level political forum, as one of the measures of leaving no one behind principle of SDGs. So, talking of SDGs, MPI is an excellent index which can be customized, or which may include some indicators which are part of the SDG indicators framework. For example, if we take such an indicator, SDG indicator, as years of schooling or school attainment, which is an indicator under number 4.1.1 of the global indicators, it is in the MPIs of Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, and Moldova. If we take such an indicators as overcrowding in the SDG 11, under the number 11.1.1, it is present in national MPIs of Armenia, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Turkey. So it's basically universal in the MPIs which are being designed or under the adaptation in this region. We also see that, for example, aid remittances dependencies considered by Armenia and Moldova. I already mentioned the exposure to environmental hazards or environmental indicators like air pollution, which is under consideration in Turkey and in Moldova. And of course, in the labor pillar, the employment and sub-employment indicators, which is also an SDG indicator under goal 8 on economic growth and employment. The number of indicator is 8.5.2, and we observe that it is in the composition of the MPI indicators for Armenia, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Turkey. We have another country, which is Tajikistan, which also was designing the national MPI with the help of the World Bank. For all I know, the Tajik MPI includes the pillars of education. It has a pillar of labor market and employment, and it also has an indicator on the demography. The third pillar is basic needs, but it also includes provision of services and infrastructure. So I want to refer to this slide on some poverty-related tools which we as UNDP were sort of considering to measure leaving no one behind. The tools which we measure in our organization intensively, and out of the ones which are presented on this slide, I want to pay your attention to the multidimensional poverty and also to the social exclusion index, which was also designed using Al-Kaya Foster method in this region and presented in one of the regional human development reports. So we consider 5 steps of leaving no one behind and 5 factors of leaving no one behind. So on the left-hand side, you see 5 steps of leaving behind. So what are these? These are 5 questions which we pose, which we need to have a tools for to answer who these people are, why they are left behind or poor, what can be done to help them, and how to measure the progress, and who is basically accountable. So through which instruments we can trigger the change. Either these are the policymakers, or these are the national development strategies or programs or action plans at the various levels, or these are other actors, players like donor community or civil society, and so on and so forth. So looks like both the multidimensional poverty index and social exclusion index, through its methodology, allows to answer all these questions of 5 steps of LNOB. But when we go to the 5 factors of LNOB, which we as UNDP say that they include discrimination. So if you are discriminated based on your socioeconomic status, it also covers issues of demography. So it's important where you live, in the remote area, in the urbanized area, near the border, or close to some countries which also influence the trade, influence the migration, and so on and so forth. It's also one of the factors is the vulnerability to shocks, both man-made and human-made, and also the level of the governance, of transparency, of good governance, democratic governance. So, and we see that the multidimensional poverty index answers the questions of demography and socioeconomic status, while the social inclusion index, also based on the Al-Kaya Foster method, is covering all of them. So here I want to stop, and I wish you the best of the time, especially since many of us are locked and working from home, and online studies become very popular. So I really hope that my overview will help you to understand where region stands and what is the potential and challenges that we face, and hope that one day you will be part of our community, which would influence the development path that you represent, the countries that you represent, and you will be one of the influential decision makers or contributors to the betterness of this world and people to live in harmony, being included and not left behind. All the best.